Good morning, everybody. I'm Claire Odie from the Community Foundation of North Central Washington. We're so happy to have all of your faces joining us today from the Zoom land all over North Central Washington. I want to thank our partners who are helping us put on this workshop today, as well as the corresponding grant program that some of you might be interested in applying for. So Icicle Fund is one of our wonderful partners. Christine and Michelle are here from Icicle Fund. And then we also have North Central Accountable Community of Health. And I believe we have Morgan and Teresa and maybe others from NCACH who've snuck into the Zoom room without me noticing. Thank you both so much for your partnership. The Icicle Fund and NCACH and the Community Foundation are partnering on a lot of great capacity building programs this year. So definitely keep your eye on our various emails and newsletters and the website to sign up for some great workshops around various capacity building and leadership topics that are relevant to nonprofits. So definitely check those out. It's been a long time partnership between the Community Foundation and the Icicle Fund, and we're very excited to be partnering more with the ACH. We're able to do so much more when we partner together. So it's very exciting. And today's workshop around getting good guidance came out of a pilot program that we did in 2021 around strategic consulting with Craig Howard and Andy Fife, who are our presenters today. And I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit more as we get going. And it was a wonderful learning process. We had Craig and Andy worked one-on-one with 14 different nonprofits in North Central Washington on organizational development projects, a lot of strategic planning and board development and succession planning and a bunch of other topics depending on what the organization's needs were. And, you know, we do a lot of programming around capacity building in a workshop format. And the wonderful thing about these consulting grants is the opportunity to get that one-on-one support with your organization. So I think this workshop is relevant to all of us as nonprofits to think about how we can best utilize outside consulting help to facilitate these strategic conversations around where we want to go as organizations. And it's so valuable when we make the investment in ourselves and the internal health of our organizations and just our ability. We're working so hard every single day, kind of our head down, getting our work done. And so to be able to pause and look up and think strategically about where we want to go is so, so valuable. So I hope that everybody gets a lot out of today's workshop. And then we'll also have some time at the end to talk a little bit more about the strategic consulting grant opportunity. You may have noticed that the application is open. It opened on February 1st and will be due at the end of March. And that's an opportunity to receive a $5,000 grant to work with an outside consultant on an organizational development project of your choice. And so we'll have some time to chat a little bit more about that opportunity at the end. Christine, or the ACH, anything I've missed that you wanted to add in before I pass it over to Craig and Andy?
I think you did beautifully, and I just am so appreciative of everybody taking the time today to invest in the future of your organization, whether or not you apply for the grant program that we're offering right now, or if you're using it for some other purpose. This is what is, as Claire said, hard to prioritize sometimes, the health of the organization in the long run. So thank you for having the awareness that it's still needed.
Wonderful. And we will also have lots of time for questions. We'll make sure that we stop and pause periodically so that you can chime in. Use the chat box, and I will be monitoring that today to make sure we get your questions answered. We've made sure to build in ample time for questions and discussion. So Craig and Andy, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks all for being here. Craig, I was going to invite you to maybe do your own personal introduction first, and then I'll dive in with mine.
Hey, thank you. I'm Craig Howard. I know a few people in the room today, which I'm very excited that folks have shown up for this. It's a terrific opportunity just a little of my background so you know why I'm sitting here. I am a consultant to nonprofit organizations, and that takes on a lot of different forms. I've really specialized in the last couple of years in strategic planning because I view that as the critical part of moving organizations forward. We so often fall victim to what I call the tyranny of the urgent, and the things that come up in front of us every single day that we must address, whether we're staff, primarily staff, and then board members as well. Strategic planning gives us that long view and makes sure that we continue to revisit the things that will move the organization forward for our communities. My background and how I got into nonprofit, which is undoubtedly, like many of you, I do not have a degree in nonprofit management. I have a journalism degree. And just over 20 years ago, a friend came to me, and both of our mothers had Parkinson's disease. And he said, I want to start a clinic for Parkinson's. I'm like, good for you. But it turned out over the next 2 years, we did exactly that. And we did it because we were passionate about it. We found board members who cared about the topic and had skin in the game as well. And that was the beginning of my nonprofit journey. And I became an avid student of governance, which sounds pretty geeky, but I just know that boards really make things happen within nonprofit organizations. So I became a big student of that. I've been doing consulting work for about 15 years, and that takes on fundraising, strategic planning, capital campaigns, crisis management, so many different things. But as I said, I really focus on strategic planning these days, and am excited to be able to help you out today.
Thanks, Craig. And I'm Andy Fife. I'm based in Seattle, but work throughout the country at this point as a consultant. I'm working with an organization about half my time with an organization that's a national consulting firm focused on the arts called Arts Consulting Group, or you might hear me at some point refer to it as ACG. In addition, I have my own consulting practice as Fife Consulting that's more local and is where I've been doing work in the non-arts space on projects with local organizations in the Pacific Northwest primarily. I have a long history of doing this work in Washington State. I was running an organization called Shunpike for many years that you might know about as an umbrella organization and as a support organization for arts groups and projects throughout the state, but primarily in Puget Sound. Whether it was there or with Fife Consulting or with ACG, I've been doing consulting and advising on nonprofits, government programming, management, policy, around the arts and other nonprofit areas for about 16 years now. I was the advocacy chair of the State Arts Commission for 8 years, and I chaired a committee of the Seattle Arts Commission for 10 years. I started my first nonprofit all the way back when I was 19 years old. It was a housing cooperative at Northwestern University for students that is still surviving and sustaining and growing today. I've obviously have a very long history with this most of my life doing this kind of work. Local nonprofits to me are the very cornerstone of democracy, even more so than government. It's the place where people come together to make decisions about their neighbors, their communities, together with their neighbors and the communities. It's the place where people come together to feel more powerful and to actually be more powerful in shaping and controlling their own lives in a way that's profound to me. And what Craig said about governance is the same for me. Making that environment, that decision-making process, that collaboration process stronger, more inclusive, and more effective is really what I've dedicated my work to. And we're happy, both of us, I think, to be able to have this opportunity to share some knowledge with you all today. The format for this is going to be probably about an hour of presentation with periodic questions involved, a question period. We'll stop, we'll pause at each section. The sections that we're going to go through, just to give you an outline of where we're headed here, we're going to start with some baseline definitions. What is organizational development? What are the various different kinds of projects that you might undertake? Why is it important to nonprofits and to nonprofit leaders? From there, we'll talk a little bit about the process generically of organizational development, change management, what are the different stages that one should think about, and then get into the roles and responsibilities of various different players in the game when going through that generic process, whether they be staff or board, outside constituents, et cetera. We'll then, and the final one there being really importantly, the consultants, since that's the topic of the day. If you've got all of these stakeholders around working through this process, what is it that you're working through and how can the consultant help? From there, then we'll give some examples from our own experience of different organizational development projects that we've been involved with and that we've led. And then finally, we'll walk specifically through the process of working with a consultant from deciding to do so, planning to do so, all the way through to the end of a contract and how to close that out. Share our own experience of how that works or sometimes doesn't work. And then we'll open it up for even further questions and discussion from there. So without further ado, let's dive in. Unless Craig, do you have anything to add to that before I move us into definitions?
No, that's a great summary of where we're going to go today. I did want to mention, which I did not, is that I'm based in the Met-How Valley. I could be anywhere on this screen, but I am based in the Met-How as well. So I know some of the organizations there and in the Wenatchee area. So anyway, thank you, Andy, for that introduction. Please carry on.
For sure. So just to lay a baseline here, let's talk through some definitions. We're going to take a minute to talk about organizational development broadly and like, what is that concept even mean? Why is it important? And then outline some typical projects that we may have been involved in or that we know about as sort of your standard organizational development types of initiatives. So starting with that just simple definition, what is organizational development? As I went to prepare for this presentation, I went to go look for existing definitions, just so that something to start with. And what was interesting is that I found this sentence in a lot of places. And if I traced back as far as I could, this particular study that was done by the Babcock Foundation in 1999 seemed to be the origin of this sentence. So I don't know that if you're into etymology or like the origins of particular thoughts and how that history comes about. Apparently the Babcock Foundation set a precedent that then showed up on lots of other websites. Organizational development is the process through which an organization develops the internal capacity to be the most effective it can be in its mission work and to sustain itself over the long term. It seems kind of obvious, but I think the thing that's important to note here is that organizational development is a process. It's not an event. It's not a single instance. It's not, oh, we held a board retreat and therefore we did organizational development. It's something that you go through in order to have change last within an organization. And that's that ending of that sentence there, sustain itself over the long term. It should lead to lasting change. And that change should be contributing to the bottom line of the mission. Now, looking at this definition, I think one of the things that it's missing is the word values. I think since 1999, we've moved into a space where organizations are expected and sort of intending to live their values more strongly alongside with delivering on their mission. So that'd be the one thing that I would add to the sentence myself. But as a definition, I think this is pretty strong. Now, why is it important? In this particular study, they asked lots of different nonprofits, why was it that they valued the organizational development experiences that they'd had? And I think these answers are pretty good. That's a process I like. I can certainly come up with my own answers, but asking lots of nonprofits what the answer to that question is a great way to answer that question. So here's the ones they came up with. I'd be curious to hear why it's important to all of you as we get into discussion. They said that existential issues are right at the top, right? Organizational development in many nonprofits' case is the very reason why they continue to exist. Whether it's in improving the systems or providing space for understanding and sharing the plans for change, survival depends on there being these processes that allow stakeholders to come together and agree upon direction and really level up at different moments in time. Speaking of leveling up, that's what the second one kind of talks about, is improvement. That organizations can really be much better if they take the time to invest in their human resources, in their technical systems, and that investment leads towards greater credibility in the eyes of constituents and supporters, especially if you include those constituents in the process. If they see that you're struggling or dealing with particular issues and that you make a plan to address them, and then you start to address them, then they feel like they're part of the process. And all of a sudden now we have this high visibility to improvement there. So being the best that we can be. The third one that the groups in this particular area mentioned came right off of that idea of working with and being visible to constituents in this, which is raising more resources. Obviously, fundraising and partnership, these things are easier to do as the capacity increases. You're improving your evaluation systems, you're communicating that evaluation better, you're collaborating with others in the community, and you're doing a better job of making sure that all the gears are well oiled in that fundraising machine, and therefore the resources flow in, leading to improved impacts, which are then more visible, and it's an upward spiral then that really can help to provide a better financial base as well as base of support. Walking the talk, and this is where the values come back in. By having some time and capacity to think about values and think about how we embody those values as a whole organization, it has led, at least in the case of those that had this experience in the 90s, to a better alignment between internal and external realization of those values. So walking the talk, practicing internally what they're seeking to accomplish externally. Finally, and most important, is the human part of this, is the people and what kind of change that people get to have and experience in these processes. Hopefully it leads towards stronger systems, more funding. Hopefully it leads towards all kinds of better messages that can be used externally about the organization and a shared understanding of direction. But most importantly is that there's an environment where people feel valued, where the board, the staff, the volunteers, people that are surrounding your mission have that experience of learning together and individually, and can therefore be more effective in performing their roles. And obviously this is very abstract, so let's bring it into the very tactical now and say, okay, if that's the broad why and what of organizational development, this is the how. What are the different places that concept can be applied to in order to see improvements, and what kind of projects can be undertaken? And for that, I'll hand it off to Craig.
Thank you, Andy. So strategic planning, as I said, is important to me, and frankly, it is critical to all organizations. One of the cliches is that, and by the way, these are typical organizational development projects that you may undertake. And strategic planning is sort of the umbrella under which everything else happens. Strategic planning is something that we kick off by talking about the difference between strategy and tactics. Humans, by and large, by nature, are very tactical. We want to solve problems immediately. We want things that are at hand, and there's the tyranny of the urgent. Those things pop up in our life, and we want to take care of them right now. Strategic thinking takes time. It's hard work. And so it's good to do it in groups because you get all the big ideas together in one place, and you can really figure out what the important stuff is. So that's what the strategic planning piece of this is. I view strategic planning as planning for the next 3 years. It's 1 year, it's going to happen. It's almost certainly going to happen 2 years, 3 years. Some people talk about strategic planning as a 5-year process, and 5 years is pretty notional to me. That's way out there. Once you've achieved some of those goals in 3 years, your priorities are going to change. You're going to learn new opportunities and new superpowers. So 3 years is a really good definition of how we strategic plan. Strategic planning is largely driven by the mission, of course. So the mission of your organization is every question you have can go back to the mission. And if it answers the mission, then it's probably a valid place to go. Now, whether it's prioritized is a choice of the board. So this is driven by the board because in strategic planning, you're almost always talking about resource allocation. how the staff is going to be taking care of problems, how much money is going to be spent in different aspects of the organization. So when you talk about resource allocation, particularly spending money, the board has to be responsible for that. They have to be deeply involved in that, of course, working with staff. But that's sort of the basis of strategic planning. It's really talking about the visionary aspects of your organization for the next 3 years or so. Board development and training is another very valid organizational development project. I'm working next week. I'm doing a short session, 2-hour session with a board to talk about what may be a campaign for them. They're trying to figure out what a campaign looks like. And so this is a training exercise that we've been talking about some other topics, but they said, can you come in and work with our board, senior staff, to talk about what a campaign may look like, what the board's role is in fundraising, and what board structure should look like for a campaign. So that's an example of board development and training. Branding and marketing and communications. So one of the things that I like to say to organizations is that good ideas get funded if the story is told well. If you don't tell the story well, you're going to have trouble getting funding and participation from the community. So branding and marketing and communication strategy, you may bring in a consultant to work on those. You can do a lot of this internally, but then you will probably bring in someone who is specifically oriented toward branding and marketing so that they can help you understand. They'll go out and survey the market and figure out how people perceive your organization, how you might change the perception through logo change, through name change, through press interactions, social media. It's a fairly broad category these days because of social media, but those are very specific and great development strategy, development project work. Fundraising strategy is an obvious one. It is something that when we first started the Northwest Parkinson's Foundation, I was told by a consultant that 50% of our time would be spent raising money. And my partner and I privately scoffed. It's like, no, we're working with Parkinson's. We have things to do. We found out that at least 50% of our work was in fundraising. So understanding, creating great strategy for fundraising will get you away from really focusing on raising money for even this budget cycle, but looking in the longer term. If you have these 3 years of strategic goals, how do you, excuse me, I was distracted by a text. I should have turned that off. How do you make sure that you are actually filling up your budget for the next 3 years so that you achieve all of your strategies? Then strategic growth and scaling. One of the things that comes from the for-profit background, which I had before nonprofit, is that in for-profit, there's a saying that you're either growing or you're shrinking. There's no in between. And in nonprofit work, that is not the case. In nonprofit work, you may not need to grow. You may feel that you need to grow because you feel that imperative all the time. There's always something to do. So it's understanding what strategic growth looks like. And strategic growth can be in your market. It can be saying maybe we should take our idea further out of our market and go into other markets. How do we scale up? So it's determining what the path is if you need to grow or if you'd like to, or even determining whether it's a valid goal. This takes us into the next one, which is another good project area, which that growth, that scaling may be through a strategic alliance, which is the simplest thing to do, partnering with another organization, either on getting a grant, as simple as that. 2 organizations applying for a grant is a powerful statement of community value, or it may be in collaborations where you're putting on programs together, for example, or it could be in pulling together a merger. One of the organizations that founded in the Seattle area, we found after about 3 years that we were pretty much duplicating what another organization that had been around for almost 20 years had been doing. We were doing very similar work, but we were growing very fast and they weren't. They were kind of static. So we talked to them, and over time we figured out it's not about us. It's not about our egos. It's not about our boards. It's really about the community. Are we going to serve them better by being one organization? We decided that was the case. And so we eventually had merged and merged under a new name. So we serve the community better by doing that, and we scaled up. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, so DEIA. This is a very big topic now, and for great reason. It was sort of brought to the forefront a few years ago, and it's become the culture in many organizations. One that I'm involved in, I'm on a board in Seattle, and they have made it a cornerstone of how they not only approach the market and tell people you're all included and we want diverse crowds and so on and so forth, but within the organization, they're living the values of DEIA, and it's made a huge difference in how they're perceived in the community, and a huge difference in how they hire and how they treat each other. So it's a wonderful project to get into organizations that may feel that they're just a bit enclosed. Finally, one of my very favorite projects is executive succession planning. And I typically just talk about succession planning because the executive is one position, but as you know, in smaller organizations, many people wear different hats. One person will wear many hats. And so it's important to know where the chips fall if someone disappears. Now, I've encountered any number of executives who say, well, I'm not going anywhere. And what I like to remind them is that succession, you choose succession or it happens to you. Not to be too granular about this, but sometimes life takes us away. Accidents happen or there are health issues. So it's very important to have succession in place. If you don't know who is succeeding you as executive director or how staff members will fill in for others, if it's a short moment or a very long one or a permanent one, you're doing a disservice to your community because you will lose efficiency if you don't know who's leading the organization. So those are all typical organizational development projects that we might consider. I think that's what I have.
Thanks, Craig. And you might note that this list looks a lot very similar to the funding program eligibility list that the Community Foundation published. And in fact, it is that list, which means that there are some other kinds of organizational development projects that you might see consultants and nonprofits engaging in that aren't on this list, such as capital campaign feasibility studies and facility development projects and other pieces like that. But we coordinated and aligned this list to match the foundation's requirements. Other definitions to note before we dive into the rest of this presentation, and really this is probably too short of a list of jargony terms that we might go into, are the typical, these are some typical words that consultants might bring up or that we are bringing up through the course of this presentation. Some of them are, these are just technical terms that we wanted to take a minute to touch base on before we start using the shorthand. So RFP and RFQ, we'll talk quite a lot about in the last section of this discussion, which are ways that an organization can communicate that there's an available opportunity to consult for them to consultants and contractors. RFP stands for, as it says here, request for proposals. RFQ stands for request for qualifications. Both of them are sort of like a job description, like, hey, world, we're interested in receiving proposals or submissions for the potential role of consultants on a project that we're about to undertake. The difference between the two of them, RFP really refers to a request for a project scope and cost, so that the consultant is proposing to undertake a particular project and articulating what that project looks like. In the case of the RFQ, the client organization is really just asking for qualifications and not for a proposal process. So even more like a job description, because the consultant would just be responding essentially with skills and experience and background, maybe references. So what is usually included in these is a description of what the project's going to look like, what kind of consultant and what kinds of skills and experience the organization is searching for, and how to respond and present that submission to the organization. So if you hear us say RFQ or RFP, that's what we're referring to, is a document that describes how a consultant should submit their information to the organization in order to be considered for the role. Stakeholders is a word I know I already said once, maybe twice. Maybe I'll say it another 15 times or more through the course of this. I find myself saying the word stakeholder a lot. Sometimes I switch and say constituents instead, more or less mean the same thing. I think Craig also uses these words quite a lot. And really stakeholders mean, to me, the people that have, that hold, that own some part of the decision-making process, that are implicated in the work of the organization, whether those be internal stakeholders like board and staff, pretty obvious that those are people that should be part of the decision-making process, or those that are donors and funders, external stakeholders, or those that are participating in the programs in some capacity, the served community, or those that are affected by the fact that this program exists, community partners, peer organizations, or just the general public in the neighborhoods and communities in which you're working. So that can be a pretty broad definition, and it's that way on purpose. But the point is, these are people that have skin in the game. That's the stakeholder base. Finally, focus groups. It's a tiny little example, but some people are like, isn't that a thing that marketing people do when they're putting together an advertisement? And yes, that's where the term comes from. But what we mean by focus groups is a part of a community engagement process when gathering information to make decisions that might be just like an interview would be between two individual people, but instead it's with a group. So it's a really great way to triangulate and get information from a group of people, whether they all be an affinity group, like, hey, we gathered together a group of our major donors, or whether they're cross affinity groups. We had one donor, we had one program participant, 2 staff members, and a board member all in the same space. This was not our committee. This is not us making huge decisions. They gathered once, we threw some ideas at them, and they responded with their experience. It's a focus group. It's like a pop-up committee. I have a feeling we might run across some other words and jargon that we think is really obvious that is not obvious. So if you hear us use a word and you think it's ambiguous or would like clarification on what it means, please pop that into the chat and we'll come back to it.
Hey, Andy,
anything to add there, Craig?
I want to toss in one more, Andy, and that is the term capacity building. Frequently, when I talk to organizations and they hear about a capacity building grant, a lot of people presume capacity simply means financial capacity. So they think a capacity building grant is to help you fundraise. Capacity building is a very broad term, and it means organizational capacity. So it can mean a lot of different things. So when you think of capacity, don't just think dollars. It could be a broader term than that.
Thanks, Craig. It's a good and important point. I wanted to open up, Claire, if there have been anything in the chat that we should respond to at this point before we move into the next section.
No big questions in the chat. There was a question about whether the slides will be provided afterwards, and I will be sending out the recording and the slides on Monday. So everyone will receive that, so you don't have to take furious notes. And then I also wanted to mention, Craig, that for some reason your volume is a tiny bit lower for some people. So if you're able to turn your volume on your mic up or talk a little bit louder, it does seem to vary from person to person. So as individuals, also make sure you press the volume up on your individual computer, and that will help as well. Thank you.
Craig has a chance to troubleshoot right now too, because I have this next section myself anyway. So
and I've just changed microphones. Am I a little better now? Can you hear me, Andy?
It's about the same for me. I'd be curious what others are experiencing.
Some have said quieter.
Okay, well, I'm just going to speak more loudly. That's what I'm going to do.
All right. Good.
In this next section, while we just heard a selection of examples of various different kinds of organizational development, and we'll come back to examples in a bit, even more specifically to pull out a few case studies. we wanted to just first kind of give a general shape to what organizational development looks like as a process. And there's a reason for this, is because there really are articulated steps and a way that a consultant and the people within an organization can specifically support and undertake the separate pieces of the process that leads to lasting change. So I'm going to quickly go through the process of preparing, designing, and managing in organizational development projects. So as you can see here, it's a simple concept that any kind of capacity building or organizational change requires diligent and deliberate preparation. There's a separation. I think a lot of people want to jump in and be like, okay, we prepared, we've got our team together. Now let's dive into planning. Let's set our goals. Let's rewrite the mission. Let's write those top priorities. But actually, for any of this to work well, no matter how long the engagement or the activity is, there should be a process of inquiry, of learning, of assessment, of information gathering, evaluation, data collection, whether it's qualitative or quantitative or both. But some process by which the group of people that have come together to undertake the change are inquiring and using curiosity first before the executive decision making that comes later. Then, once that's gathered, do the planning process, set priorities. What issues did we see? How did we come, you know, what kind of challenges and opportunities are here that we want to try and make change around? Okay, now that we understand that, how do we want to make that change? Let's set really targets and benchmarks and goals and objectives that we can reach towards, as well as a path for how we're going to get there. That path for how we're going to get there then informs the next phase of the process, which is execution, in which you line up all the pieces and actually do it. And then finally, any good organizational development project requires good reflection and review in order to make sure that the change that has been undertaken is going to be lasting and sustainable, and that it doesn't need additional work in order to finish out systems that have been developed or add even additional systems. And if it does, that's why that last arrow is there, then it's time to undertake yet another project. And it really is important to understand that none of these are done 100% ever. In fact, it's the process of building your organization is something that should last far into the future. Each step of the way, just to spend a little bit of time on each one. And I saw a hand go up, and I'm just going to go ahead and say, let's go ahead and have the question at this moment. Sarah.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Well, I can see that you're going to go through each bubble, so it might be more appropriate, but kind of to your last point about like how this is kind of always going on. And when you're in an organization that is growing, like we are, and we have like new board members coming on and potentially new staff, like what, almost like what tools at each of these bubbles, especially like inquiry, like we've done a ton of research, we have a ton of information, but we don't have a very good clearinghouse for that to like inform new people coming into the process. So if you might get to that, but that's kind of my question of like some tips on that.
It's a great question. And if I don't get to it, please remind me and I'll come back and talk about it. And I can talk about it both in the review reflection slide as well as in the inquiry one. But let's take a minute on preparation first, and then we'll get there. Thanks for that question, though. So the first stage of the process, and always the most important, is to make sure that preparation is done so that there's a strong groundwork and foundation for the organizational development project. And speaking, I think, to a little bit of what Sarah just brought up, I'll just name this. It's important to understand these as projects. Your board, your staff, your organization should be engaged in organizational development all the time. It's a constant conversation. But by saying, okay, we are doing this initiative, it's kind of like a campaign. You're always doing fundraising, but if you run a campaign, you know what the goals of that time period and that process is or are. I don't know what grammar I'm using today, but you can set those goals, you can set those targets, you have the tools and elements that are specifically for that campaign. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then it comes back to ground. Similarly, yes, you're always undertaking improvement and growth and development for your organization. But here, this is going to be a moment where you're taking a big step up on the ladder, and not just kind of doing the incremental constant change, but carving out a piece and saying we're going to take a leap forward. So what are the pieces that are required for that leap forward? What are the issues that we're addressing with that leap forward? What is the time frame that project should take place in? Who is it that's required in order for us to have success within that project? And what resources and tools are we going to need in order to be successful? Putting all that down on a piece of paper, ironically, if what you're creating is a strategic plan, one of the best ways to go through the strategic planning process is creating a strategic plan, and stepping out at the beginning and preparing by putting down what are those objectives, who is it that's involved in this process, what tools are we needing as resources in order to get the work done, and what are the shared expectations that we should expect to pursue. Once that consensus is there, it's articulated, it'll be much easier for the staff, the board, the constituents, the consultant, to come in and keep those mileposts in mind, even if they change. Having that basis really articulated and shared at the beginning can really help. Then the inquiry process. Once that team is assembled and those mileposts and benchmarks are really defined, you can undertake that data collection process, that information and learning and collection process. Even if it's just going to be a quick, like, hey, we're putting a committee together, there's going to be a board retreat, and then we're going to use that to make some, quick objectives for the next 18 months. It's good to not just go in and have everybody just show up at the board retreat with no preparation. If all the people that are walking into that room take a minute to engage some constituent out in the world and bring in that data point, then they've done one of the most critical things that a board member needs to do, which is understand their role as a representative. We always walk into the room with our full selves, but we don't always remember to bring all the other people that we represent in these processes. So really the process of inquiry in a planning process or an organizational development process is the process of learning and connection to the greater realm of information and people that make up the organization. This can be done through surveys, this can be done through interviews, it can be done through research. That research can be analyzed and synthesized so that not every board member is delivered a 150-page packet with every survey question and every single interview note that was there, but the key findings. And at the end of the process, which I'd consider another word that we could use for it is diagnostic. At the end of this diagnostic process, there are facts that are known and shared about the organization that don't necessarily say what should happen or could happen to change it, but just describe what it is. At the end of what it is, actually, let me address a little bit what Sarah brought up. Facts that are shared, the shared part of that's important. So whether this is in a set of reports that are given to everybody, or whether they're in a set of reports and documents that are in a shared location, it's important that the stakeholder base, there's that word, of the organization who are engaged in this process all have access to the same information. So we're going to talk a little bit more later about the resources that one might consider setting up in the preparation process. But one of them that's really obvious is a file sharing location of some kind. And yes, there's people that have Microsoft Outlook systems or SharePoint systems. There are people that have Google Documents and have giant server style systems with lots of folders for their organization. And they're like, here board, you have access to all this. It's not just about having access, but having access to the same specific pieces of information. So a folder or a packet or binder of printed material that is consistent and updatable across everybody is really key. And Google Drive is a pretty strong, not that I'm here to advocate for any one particular product or organization, but Google Drive is a pretty strong and accessible environment for that. The fact is, you're always going to end up with some people that have technology issues or access issues. In fact, my recommendation would be to not just have one solution, but maybe 2 or 3 that are access points, just so long as the same information's in all of those places or provided to all of the people that are involved in some way. Shared base of knowledge, shared data set, the inquiry process leading to shared facts that are understood and believed. Once that's done, now decisions and discussion can happen. What are the most important problems we saw, or what would we even consider to be a problem? You know, the staff is 12 full-time equivalent. Is that enough people? Is that too many people? Are they organized well? This process of planning is the process of analysis, synthesis, and leading to not just a shared understanding about what priorities are there from an issues perspective, what's wrong or what's right, but how to address them. We've said diagnostically that our organization has this set of issues. Now, how do we want to overcome them, or dive deeper into them? What goals do we have? What objectives are there? And how are we going to move through the time frame in order to make that change? Connecting plans to resources and infrastructure is just a bullet point on this, but it's really the most important part of it. An organization in the process of planning at this point in the process should be able to say, oh, our mission says this, our strategic objectives say these, our tactical plans are this, and our operations are thus. And you should be able to trace and say, the reason why we're going to increase by a half a full-time position in this area, and buy this particular piece of software or technology or whatever it is, can be traced back through this and traced back to the mission, right? That kind of alignment is really what we're going for. It's the reason why these processes exist, is to really be able to see alignment through from strategy all the way down to the everyday operational interactions that are taking place. And then finally, not only are these plans written and shared and understood internally to the committee or the board or staff leadership that are engaged in the process, but they're shared broadly to all the stakeholders that have been part of the process, and to make sure that there's consensus there, that this isn't a plan that is just for the 3 people who have budget control. This is a plan for everyone who's contributing anything to the process. Then, if it is truly the plan for everyone contributing to the process, it's time for those people to contribute. So organize the people around the change that's going to take place. Change processes and policies. It's not just about putting a new database system in place. It's telling the person who opens the envelopes with checks in them how to enter the information into that database. It's not just about having a new strategic report for the board of directors. It's informing the program manager how to talk to the various different program people and make sure that the data points are being fed over to the managing or executive director and getting those data points into a report. So, embodying the change throughout. How does it get spread? How does it get acculturated? And culture is one of the points one of the words I wanted to point to in the slide. This isn't just about policy. It isn't just about technology improvements or new staff members. In fact, it's about language and focus and how you talk in meetings. Sometimes even just the language and values of the organization are going to have an opportunity to shift in order to better reinforce the direction and goals that the organization has laid out. And finally, again, just like at the end of the planning process, that change needs to be communicated well. So if the change is taking place, make sure that there's a way to see the change, because all these people have now invested in the change internally and externally, whether they're donors or staff members who have now had to change the way that they do their jobs. And for them to feel that connection back to the mission and back to the improvement of the organization in terms of experience internally and externally, visibility and transparency in that is really key to continued growth, which is why the review section is so important. Evaluate the process, evaluate the progress for the work that's happened, report the results, and keep that question open about whether the change is done or whether it needs to continue or whether there's a new process that needs to be undertaken. And hence that arrow at the end that goes back into preparation. I know that this is abstract and we're going to get into more concrete versions of this very broad process in a second. But before we do, is there anything that's come up in the chat or that you've thought of as I've been talking about this broad process of preparation, inquiry, planning, execution, and review?
Yeah, feel free to take a moment to gather your thoughts and put some questions in the chat, or you can do what Sarah did and you can raise your hand and come off mute. That works too. But just want to give an opportunity to quickly just pause, kind of let that everything land for a moment. And if there's any initial questions, we'll have some time to address those.
Great.
Okay.
And questions can come whenever. But at this moment, I'm going to hand it off to Craig. If that's the generic process, Craig's going to talk a little bit about the roles within it for various different people that might be part of the team.
All right, I'm back. And I'm hoping my sound is better. I had an external microphone I took out, so hopefully I'm back to a hearable level. Andy, can you give me a thumbs up or down? Okay, Claire's giving me a thumbs up. Getting all kinds of thumbs up. All right. All right, so let's talk about roles and responsibilities. So it is hard to generalize about this because I know that we've got organizations. There's an organization I'm on the board of, and there's 60 board members, and it's a $30 million organization. And I'm also involved in an all-volunteer organization. So I know that I'm going to be speaking to all kinds of different people and different situations today. So please ride along with me and know that some of this stuff will or may not fit. But I want to talk about the responsibilities that come up as we go through some of the processes to change the organization, to move it forward. And the first one is staff, and the staff's responsibilities. Frequently, as I said, people are wearing a whole bunch of different hats. So if you have a staff of 3 people, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of different things that you're all doing. And even when you have a staff of 12, as Andy mentioned, you're still going to be doing that. It happens. It's rare in small to medium organizations that we get to specialize that fully. As you know, a good visualization is that we've got a 12-ounce cup and we're always pouring 16 ounces into it. It's just what happens in nonprofits because we are passionate about doing good. And I have to tell you that frequently it's the board that is super passionate, and they come together for a meeting once a month or once every 2 months with perhaps some committee work in between. Frequently, the work comes back to the staff. So it's important that the staff has a way, there's a mechanism that they can be heard about what's possible and what's not. I have a big thing about transparency, or at least translucency. All the staff doesn't need to know everything all the time. That can be quite distracting, but the staff does need to have some level of understanding of what's going on behind the scenes at the board level, so that things don't blindside them. When people are involved in planning, staff particularly, when they're involved in the planning process, they're more bought in. So that's to say that a lot of things come to the staff. The staff has to be able to put up some boundaries around staff capability and the time that's available to them to get things done, and other resources, money, equipment, technology, etc. But the staff is going to be the implementer, largely, not always. As I said, in an all-volunteer organization, all those board members become essentially staff members at times because they have to get things done. Involving senior and other staff members in decisions that impact their workflow, it improves buy-in. When people have been involved in making decisions, they've been heard. Some of their ideas actually show up in the the marching orders. They feel invigorated by that. So it's really important to have the staff involved in those conversations. Next, let's talk about board. So the board, we'll talk more about how boards are formed, but occasionally, frequently in smaller organizations, boards happen by default. I have a brilliant idea, and I tell my 5 closest friends, would you please help me with this? I need your help right now. We end up with 5 people who have the same network. And so having a diverse board is really important. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but the board is the basic thing about board is that they have governance and fiduciary responsibility. And that is the most distant and sort of sterile board. They're watching for any malfeasance. They're making sure that we exist by the bylaws and that we are not overcommitting financially or committing to things that we cannot actually pay for. So that's the most basic and sterile, as I say. That is, in the real world, I don't care the size of your organization or the financial resource. There's still much more involvement from board, particularly in organizations that I see represented today. I know that those board members are deeply involved in all kinds of day-to-day things. They may be involved in event committees. They may be involved in financial work with the board, with the staff. And so the board has responsibilities that sometimes go well with outside of the lines that they're supposed to be working in. And that often is welcomed. And sometimes it's important for the staff to step in and say, this is kind of an overreach and this is our job to manage this. So as I've told organizations and boards that I've been on, our role usually as board members is to assist staff members getting their work done, making sure that they've got all the resources that they need and that they've got the connections they need to move things forward. And so that's a strong responsibility of the board, is to make sure that that they're carrying the flag for the organization and opening all the doors and easing things for the staff. In strategic planning particularly, and then in other places, but in strategic planning, I'm quite insistent that we get as many people from the board as possible involved in the decisions, in the process to a decision. Partly because board members are there because they do know things. They know a ton of stuff. They know the right people. They're going to help you do things, but they also are responsible at the end of the day. So if you have someone or a number of people not showing up for board meetings where strategic planning decisions are made, they may not be bought into the process. So I really want to get all the voices in the room. So that's a strong responsibility of the board. I occasionally have board members who say, listen, I don't have time for 3 meetings a month, all these different things, and being part of this and being part of that. I am a strong advocate for a strong committee structure is important, and that will take the load off of the entire board and really let people who care about the finance aspect of the organization to specialize, and then they can report back to the board from a finance committee aspect. Beyond that, when you get into strategic planning, you may have something that pops up that's really not committee level, but it's something that has to be figured out by someone. And I'm an advocate for task forces. So a task force is something that pops up, solves a problem, goes away. So in a task force, you'll have 2, maybe 3 people, can be more, not less than 2, then it's not really a task force, it's just a task person. But you really want to have a group of people who can go off, come up with the best ideas to figure out the way forward on an issue, take back those best ideas to the board, then they can make a decision together. But rather than have 15 people working on an idea, you can have 3 and they can come back with the best options. So these are the places where the board needs to be responsible and can really participate to help the organization move forward. Next slide. So while Andy was talking, I was thinking this is kind of juvenile, but we could have a drinking game. You have to have a shot of coffee every time we say stakeholder. We'd be jittery mess by the end of this, because stakeholders it really encompasses a lot of different people who are involved with our organization. Funders and partners are critical stakeholders. They are different from the served community in that they really want to see success. When funders really want to see their money used as a tool. They want to see success. Frequently, people don't really view it as a dollar as much as a solution. And so, we all know how to measure dollars, but solutions are a different story. So helping funders and partners be involved in processes that they need to see a good result come from is very important. So frequent discussions with funders and partners about early stage plans, and not just as you've already made a decision. This happens a lot in capital campaigns and then projects where you're going to build something, for example. You want to get early input. The funders and partners frequently have knowledge that you may not have. They've been through this before. I find this a lot with significant financial partners where they'll say, oh gosh, I've done 7 buildings like this. Let me tell you the fastest way to get from here to there. So I find it's just super useful. Frequently, they'll have opinions that may not fit in with what you're trying to do. And that's just a discussion point. It's something we all need to discuss, but involving them early and often is very important. Next slide. When we started the Northwest Parkinson's Foundation and we were going to open this national clinic for Parkinson's, we had a consultant come in and he asked us precisely how many people would be in the meeting, and we told him. And then there was an extra chair that he made prominent in the room. He put it near the center of the room. And eventually one of us said, do you want us to move that chair out of the way? And he said, no, that chair is for the person who can't be here. This is the person you represent in the community. These are the people that you serve. So that chair will sit there. And every time we have a question about what we're doing, we need to look at that chair and make sure that those people are being served by what we do. So it seemed like a corny exercise at the time, but I swear I've talked about it over 20 years because it really helps groups get recentered on why they're there. We're all excited about the progress and the places that we can help the community, but remembering precisely who it is, and that is our community members. And so community members will take responsibility if we give them an opportunity. So the more we speak with people, and as Andy said, going into a strategic planning session, for example, one of the jobs of a board member would be great if they could talk to a few people in the community and just talk about the organization and how it's perceived in the community and how they think that it's impacting their lives. Those are super important data points. And so that's a relatively informal way of doing it. But you can that also shows up in focus groups where you get 10 or 12 people together and have a conversation over an hour or 2 hours to find out what's working for them, what messaging works, what programs work. Those are the places where community members can really impact the organization. And that's the impact we need to have. So in the community, it's the people who are served, and it's also people peripheral. So when I was involved, for example, the Loop is here today, Brent Norris. The Loop is a ski area in Okanagan County. It's a nonprofit. But when I talk to the community about Loop, there were a lot of people I talked to who don't ski. But their perception of what the Loop does for the community was really valuable in how we crafted the message. We didn't want to craft it just for skiers, just for avid skiers and people who wanted to, get a good meal, hot meal during the day while they were skiing. We wanted to talk to people about why the Loop matters to them, even though they may not be skiers or snowboarders. And that was that really crafted the message we told. So participation by community members is a really important part of what we do. And finally, so consultants. Consultants come in many forms, and we're talking right now, Andy and I do a particular type of consulting, but what we tell organizations when they're looking for a consultant, what are you looking for? What specific issue are you trying to get to the root of, and find the right consultant for that job. Consultants bring As I say, they all vary. So it depends on what their background is. But in the case of myself and Andy and not an insignificant number of other consultants like us who are running our own shops, we started nonprofits. We've been on boards. We've then also staffed nonprofits. We've been in many different roles. So we have experience there. But we're bringing best practices that not only have we seen within the work that we've done on staff or on boards, but also that we've read about. We spend a lot of time studying up on what are the best practices. DEI, DEIA, the diversity question, is one that I've gone off to classes for because it was something that in the first, 15 years of my work in the nonprofit realm, I was not very aware of it. And so about 6 years ago, I went to a DEIA seminar and learned a great deal about it. I am by no means a consultant on the DEI issue, but I have a pretty good background. So we're always studying up on these, and those are part of the best practices questions. So we have experience, as I say, in other similar situations. And so it's helpful. One of the most powerful things in nonprofit, because many times we feel alone in the work that we do and feel, gosh, has anyone ever done this before? Empathy is one of the most powerful drivers. When you find out that others are dealing with the same issues or have and found solutions, it's very powerful and enabling. So we bring that experience from other organizations. We're a sounding board. So consultants are sounding boards for staff, board members to say, let me try this on. Let me see if this would work. Frequently, in the nonprofit realm, what I find is that just like when we started our nonprofit years ago, I didn't have any experience. And so I had huge blind spots within the work I was doing. So I really needed to talk to people about, am I crazy? Because I don't see this or I don't understand this. And so having a sounding board, especially on the board members, almost always come from the for-profit realm. Not always, but frequently. And so you find people that don't have a lot of nonprofit experience, but they're passionate for the cause. So for them to have a sounding board like a consultant who is an independent third party, they don't have to worry about ruffling feathers or anything else. They can tell you the straight story. So it's a great place to bounce ideas back and forth. Consultants will, because of this, the experience, they can bring frameworks that they know might work for the work that you're doing right now. If you're going to go into this sort of process, here's a framework that we saw in another organization that worked quite well. We can modify this, but we'll bring frameworks that have been shown to sort of expedite the success rather than sort of trying different things on. We can say, let's cut these things out and really focus here. So we can bring you framework. And so talking to consultants that you're interviewing for your process and you have specific goals, it's great to say, have you been in this situation before? And do you have a framework through which we might work to make this more efficient? So timelines for each segment of the work being undertaken. Because consultants have hopefully been there before, you're finding a consultant that can help you. Something like strategic planning and then something else which is outside of the work that we're doing today, but a capital campaign. They can tell you how long this phase of the work should take and how long in strategic planning, for example. In the beginning, we're going to want to interview each one of the board members, for example. We're going to want to spend some time with the senior staff. It'll take this long. We're going to do a survey period that's going to take 2 weeks. After that, we're going to go into this. So they can tell you pretty much how long those segments are going to take, and work with your board and staff to make sure that those are timelines that work for them, and expand them or shrink them depending on the work at hand. In the end, consultants need to bring back a document. So I'm really big on SMART goals, which are goals that are going to be assigned to people. They're achievable goals, and that they're time limited, so that at the end of it, you can come back and say, when I worked with your board, as we worked through this organization's strategic plan, we decided you wanted to get this done, this done, this done, these 5 goals. So who's responsible now? Who's going to take a hold of these things and make sure that they get done? When are they going to report back to the board, for example? So it's assigning responsibility, but it's also talking about the overall feelings of how the process went, how the organization can really propel themselves forward, so that because the consultant has that experience, they can give you some idea of where this is going to go, how long it's going to take. And the summary should really give people an idea of what happens next. So those responsibilities of the consultant, there's a lot more to that when it comes to contracting and all the other things that we're going to get into shortly. I think that's it.
Thanks, Craig. The one thing I wanted to add to the generic abstract consideration of various different roles, and particularly the consultant's role in it, is that, Craig just talked about various different documents that they're bringing back as deliverables that we're bringing back, and I think what's really important to note is that there are some of those that are the consultant's authorship entirely. Those are usually things where they ran a survey or they did the interview process, and they're kind of bringing their observations to the table. Maybe it's their research that they did. What's really important is that when you get into the objectives and the goals, when you get into the strategic plan language itself, the mission language, or in the case of like a branding process, the actual brand messaging, it shouldn't be their language. It doesn't matter what the consultant thinks. They're going to get a check and send you an invoice and sign their contract off and go away. It's got to be your language. So at the end of the day, when that document's brought, the authorship should feel more like, in those critical strategic plan language, should feel like it's the organization's language. It should be in their words. If the consultant's creating that document, at the end of the day, they should be doing it as a facilitator, not as an author. The organization is the author, and what the consultant's role is to bring all the voices together and make sure that they all end up on the page. Talking about that abstractly is great. What we're going to do next is get into some specific case studies, examples, in order to illuminate the concepts a little bit more. I think, I was just about to say, is there anything in the comments that we should answer as a question? I saw one pop up just as I was looking down. Before we move too far into the case studies, any questions that we should address?
Yeah, so Lacey put in the chat, before we get too far past the cycle Andy was talking about, can we clarify how much of that work should be completed before engaging consultants?
That's great. Let me put the cycle back up. And let's go to the preparation slide. We'll get to this a little bit more in the nuts and bolts of it in the final part of the presentation, but we might as well take a second and talk about it here as well. Really, the preparation process includes getting the consultants, right? Collecting the resources and people. I would say that you want to identify the consultant at this point in time. So, it's right away. In fact, even some of the parts of the preparation process, depending on the consultant, depending on the project, you may want the consultant to be there to help with the discovery process and the, collection of the various different internal documents that are going to be required in order to do an assessment or an evaluation. That said, I think what's important is to look through the entire process first before going and getting a consultant, and that there may be steps along the way. Let's say the organization decides that they're going to undertake the process themselves and not have a consultant involved, where you bring one in for one sliver of the process. So there are options. And an example I'll give there is that you might even have two consultants, right? Like, you come and engage arts consulting group. If you're an arts organization and you're going to come in and bring an arts consulting group to do the full strategic planning process over the course of a 4 or 5 month period, and we're going to put this whole plan together along the way. Well, before you even bring us in, you got to make sure that the $40,000 cost for a national consulting firm is going to make sense, and that what you need is a 4 or 6 month process. It may be that actually all we need is like a 3-week process, with a little bit of preparation, a board retreat, and then a sort of notes document that articulates an 18-month process. So I think that's the level of preparation that's required before you need to go out and start talking to consultants, is to really understand what the size and scope of the project is during that preparation phase. But once you do have that size and scope down, it can't hurt to go out and start talking to folks and to invite them in. There is a possibility, though, and that you undertake the preparation, the inquiry phase, and even into the planning phase, and then it's time to put the board retreat together out of it, and just go get a consultant just to facilitate the board retreat, for example. That's a sort of modification of the process that I have seen several times and participated in several times. I will say, as a consultant, it's less fun, and I'm not as impactful in my role as a facilitator. When I step into a room like that, where the organization has done a lot of pre-work and is planning to keep going without me, I tend to just be more of almost like the orchestra conductor for the meeting. And it's like, I need to hear a little more of the trombones right now, right? My role tends to be a little bit more about just illuminating the voices in the room and bringing in and keeping the clock going, which I'm good at, and it's great. But the part where I can participate in helping an organization really identify which stakeholders they want to engage in order to gather those voices, then bring them into the room, then process that into strategic language over the course of a 6-week process or a 3-month process, is powerful. And even if they just wanted to bring me in to facilitate the board meeting, it's helpful if I'm aware of the process that they're undertaking the rest of the time. So I suggest doing it early. Craig, do you have anything to add to that?
No, it's such a good point, though. I occasionally have been brought in. It's like they've done all this work and they said, can you just moderate a meeting for us, or a strategic planning final? And that's simply making sure that all the voices are heard, which is terribly important. But me having an understanding of what the internal voices are talking about, what the stakeholder voices, that's all super important. So being involved early is just a more satisfying process for most organizations, and for me, certainly.
There's a comment in the chat that got a +1. So I think some folks are thinking about this, of the difficulty is when you don't know what you don't know. And so how do you know what scale or scope you need before the consultant is brought on? We've run into this before when we want the consultant to help us figure this out, to figure out what's needed. Some are good at it and some want the scope already figured out. Any thoughts on that, Andy or Craig?
I think that's a great observation. And one of the things that I know I do, and I can't speak for all consultants everywhere and every kind and style of consultant that's out there, but I consider assisting and advising people in thinking about what size and scale of a strategic process they're going to undertake. I consider that part of my business development. I just think it's good. It's a smart way to operate. If at the end of the day, they don't go with me, but I helped them do a better job deciding who they were going to go with, then I feel good about that. And I've created goodwill with an organization that may come back to me later, or may send me a referral for somebody who is going to find that my services are correct. So, I think in the same way that engaging in the with people in networking when you're looking for a job or looking to hire someone, that you might have informational interviews in which you're clarifying sort of things about how you might even talk about the job before you post it. Oh, hey, we're thinking about adding a development director position. I'm going to go talk to people that are development directors and find out how we might structure and think about that position before we're actually hiring for it. And you might talk to somebody who would make a great development director. You might talk to somebody who actually wouldn't be a good development director for you, but really knows a lot about it, right? I think going out there and at the beginning of the process, talking not to 7 or 10 consultants, but a couple of people before you're necessarily offering them the job of being the consultant could be a great way to clarify the scope and really understand how that dynamic can happen back and forth at that time, which is something we're going to talk about a little bit later as we get into this. Craig, I saw you gave me a +1, which feels good. Do you have anything to add to that?
It is part of doing the job well, just as you said. Frankly, I don't care if I don't get the work. I want to make sure they're getting good guidance. I'm such a sucker for nonprofits and doing good work. But when I get a chance to talk to someone, and I get these calls occasionally saying, "Oh, I know that you're a consultant, but is there any chance we can chat about this?" Absolutely. Let's go have coffee, talk about what your challenge is, and I'll give you some steps forward. I mean, I may never hear from you again, but chances are we're going to continue the conversation. And yeah, I think that's just part of the process, and I'm happy to engage in it.
I thought of one other thing too that I know, Craig, you've had this experience too. But when I do a project strategic planning process, we set it up in phases that mimic some of this process document that we're looking at here on this slide. In terms of there being a discovery process, an inquiry, or external stakeholder engagement process, and then synthesis planning, and at each step of the way, there's usually a recalibration of what follows. And so building that into the expectations, even if you are hiring a consultant and saying, this is the size and scale of the scope that we expect to undertake, once you dive into your background documents and you do an internal survey or engage that committee and put them together, it may turn out that actually you don't just want to run 3 interviews and one focus group, that you want to run a full survey and do a full 360 look at all of your partners and peers before you're in that planning retreat. And now all of a sudden you're increasing the size of that phase too. Well, hopefully that consultant is ready to recalibrate that at the end of phase 1. And so I find myself more and more sort of having these moments within the project too, as well, where you're coming back to the preparation steps again in order to on a process moment by process moment basis, so that you sort of resetting, recalibrating expectations, and maybe possibly even changing the scope of the contract if necessary.
Hey, Andy and Craig, before we jump into this next section, because it's been an hour and a half, I wonder if we can take
Quick break.
5-minute break for people to use the restroom and get water and stretch a little bit, and then we can maybe come back at 10:35 and continue on. Does that sound like a good plan? Okay.
Sounds good to me.
All right. I muted myself. If you want to turn off your video for the 5-minute break, feel free to do so. Okay, we'll give folks another minute or so to rejoin us. And then we'll jump back in. Thanks, Andy and Craig. All right, it's 10:35, so we're going to go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Claire. Welcome back, everybody. So we started today by setting some definitions. We followed up with that by looking at sort of a generic process for change, as well as then the various sort of roles and responsibilities that each of the different people on the team might have in this, whether they're staff or board, funders and partners, community members, or the consultants themselves. Now let's take this into the concrete world and talk about concrete examples of organizational development. We have 3 or 4 different projects that Craig and I are going to outline that we've done in the past that'll illuminate some of these ideas about organizational development. I'm going to start with one that I have been, an organization that I've been involved with for many years now, actually, as a consultant. And the first project that I did with them about 5 years ago, that was a little bit more of a substantial project. And it was a board training and development and assessment sort of process by which the organization was taking a look at their board of directors and their governance environment and how the board gathered and how it operated, and looking and saying, how could we change this? Pratt Fine Arts Center is a sort of a tactile workshop space for artists and students to learn various different arts-based crafts. They have a wood shop, a woodworking shop, a glass studio, a metalworking shop, a painting studio. They have printmaking abilities there, and in it, you can go in there and use them as a member. And then there are a number of classes with faculty that are specialized in teaching particular parts of those processes or introducing people to those shops and to those type of creative activities. It's a excellent organization. It's been around for a long time. I think it's 25 or 30 years old at this point. And it's right in the central district of Seattle. About 5 years ago, they called me in to specifically ask questions about how the board should change. They had a 22-member board of directors. It tended to be an older board, a whiter board, a more affluent board, as many boards of directors are, because it's primarily people who are coming from what would be considered a funder or donor style person or profile. They were a very successful board in terms of their engagement levels, but they had many board members who had been on board for a really long time, so change was sort of harder to accomplish, and they didn't have any kind of term limits in place or anything along those lines. So what I was invited to do was to come in and run an assessment on the board of directors in order to let them gather around change. So it was almost like a strategic plan for governance that we wrote. So the process that we undertook, we came together and decided what the scope of this was going to look like. They knew that they wanted to bring a consultant in and run some sort of evaluative process that would result in a report that they could put in front of the board of directors and make decisions based on that. So we chose to do that over the course of a 3-month period. We had a small subcommittee that really was primarily the board chair and the executive director at the time that I met with on a pretty much bi-monthly basis. It was sort of every 2 to 3 weeks we would come together throughout the process. And even besides the pieces that I was bringing and the stages that we were in our board development planning process, they also were bringing me questions that were coming up in board meetings or in committee meetings. And so I was engaged in a little bit of leadership coaching along the way as well. We would talk about topics that weren't just the evaluation and the retreat that we were planning for. But the main thing that we were working towards was there being this planning document that was going to come out of 2 different 4-hour retreats that we did. So that was the shape of the project over the course of 3 months. I would say that I met with the chair and the executive director there probably 6 or 8 times, somewhere in there. We ran the self-assessment report. It was an existing evaluation that I had that I just customized the language a little bit in order to make it appropriate to Pratt's particular programming and community. And we did that as a SurveyMonkey survey. The board filled out the questionnaire and I gathered the information and made both the full survey results as well as my own synthesized findings report that I put on top of those survey results available to the board of directors. I met first with the executive director and the board chair to review that more than once in order to figure out how we would present it and prepare the retreat workshops. And then the 2 workshop retreats happened over the course of about a 4-week period, with them all having a little bit of homework in between. And then that resulted at the end in a plan that said, within, these are our top objectives as a board of directors in the next 3 months, the next year, the next 3 years. And most of the work that they were looking to accomplish was going to take place within an 18-month period. The results of this were great, and their board of directors is, I won't say transformed, that's a very big word, but it is changed. If you look at it today compared to where it was, it's younger, it's more diverse racially, it's more diverse in pretty much every way, economically, education-wise, and otherwise. It's smaller, which was a decision that they made in order to have more focused discussions within the board environment. At this point, I think some people feel it may be a little too small, but that happens. Sometimes these changes go a little bit farther than you want them to, and you got to bring it back. But they successfully changed something that needed to change and hadn't been changing for a long time. There was another major event that happened during that time, which is COVID. So that obviously is a major event that really changed the culture and environment of the board of directors. And so we can't necessarily attribute all of the transitions that took place there to this plan that we wrote 5 years ago. But they were able to use it as a guidepost for them as they moved through those changes. And at the end of it, I remained connected to the organization, and every once in a while, a board member would reach out and just touch base and get my direction and guidance on how their board was going. And I retain that friendship to today. It feels really good because then when I joined Arts Consulting Group a year ago, and they were ready to conduct their executive director transition, they hired us and I led that process as well. So you can see that a consultant isn't just necessarily useful for that one project, but can be a relationship that is intermittent and comes back for future projects. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Craig to talk about a couple of projects as good examples of strategic planning, which are not that different probably than what I just described.
Nope, it's very similar. Thank you, Andy. I'm actually going to talk about 3. There's another one in between these 2. We've got the Museum of Flight and Sustainable NCW. And then I have, so one is a huge organization, one is a small, quite grassroots organization. Then I have something in the middle, which was a project last year. So the Museum of Flight is in Seattle, and many of you may have visited or heard of the Museum of Flight. It is the largest private air and space museum in the world. And that's kind of staggering to think of, but it's a huge asset to the Seattle market and to the history of aviation in general, aerospace. But the museum, I've been on that board for 16 years, so I'm going to speak as from the perspective of actually being on that board and participating. But I've been on that board for 16 years, which is too long. I'll be leaving next year. I encourage every organization to consider term limits. But I've been deeply involved in governance and in fundraising there. So I was particularly interested when they brought on a strategic planner last year. This organization is something I call Big Ship, Small Rudder. This is an organization that is so well established and does what it does so well that pivoting to new activities, new ideas, a new strategic plan, it's a very long, slow turn. And so you're not going to have any major shifts very quickly. So over the 16 years, when I first got on that board, I was considered, I kept being thanked by people for being one of the young people on the board. And I was just under 45 years old. So I laughed at that at the time. And now I really laugh at it. But it used to be considered an organization that was old guys who liked old airplanes. Very soon after I joined the board, we started to move toward being a much stronger educational presence. We really found that we could use it to teach STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, curricula, and after-school courses, summer courses. So it became an educational museum. They took that mandate very seriously, and now the organization is absolutely about educating kids from very, very young all the way into college. So it's giving people an opportunity, and primarily giving people who might not have opportunity otherwise. So they've really pivoted that way. One of the things that had not happened, though, is they had not updated their mission, vision, and values. They hadn't had a value statement. They had mission and vision, but they hadn't updated that in some time. We'd kind of brushed up the strategic plan over time, but brushed up is about right. So the board hired a consulting firm out of Salt Lake City that began work last June. And it turned into, it is a 10-month process of strategic planning. This strategic planning process is, as you might imagine, it's high dollar. This is a staff of over 200 people. It's a budget of $30 million a year. So it's a great big organization that can afford to bring in a big consulting group. But that big consulting group brings in a template that they want to lay on to the Museum of Flight that's like other organizations that they've worked with. But it's a process of surveying staff, surveying executive, surveying the rest of the board, and dipping in and out. We have a task force for this that's 7 people that from the board. I'm not on that task force, even though I do a lot of strategic planning. I didn't volunteer for that. I figured it was best that other people that were less biased jumped into this. Yet, as a board member, I've been included in 3 meetings. We've had retreats for this and a number of surveys. So it's a comprehensive process. And what it's done is it has refreshed the mission statement. And I have to tell you, when you're considering a change like that, a mission statement is something that a lot of funders and community members look to understand what they're giving to and why they care about your organization. So when you change a mission statement, you have to be cautious and make sure you're including a lot of people in that conversation. You don't want to disaffect populations and major funders because you've gone a different direction. So mission and vision we're both are in the update process right now. We're going to get full results in April, but it's been a comprehensive process, and it's changing a number of our programs and committing us to a very different course. DEI is a big part of what's being changed within the organization. We'd already begun that process a couple of years ago, but it's really having an impact. But our board over the last few years has really begun to reflect this other community, the community that we serve, not just the old guys with old airplanes, but it's now reflecting the educational opportunities and the population that is really attending the museum. So we're doing a good job of listening to the world, but the strategic plan is really helping us state those things very clearly, what we're going to do for the next 3 to 5 years. And I can say 5 years in this case, because it is a big ship with a small rudder, the changes are not huge. They're kind of incremental. And so we can state 5 years from now, we want it to look like this. So another example is an organization I worked with last year. We did a 6-month process that could possibly have been a 3 to 4 month process, but it's the Washington State Academy of Sciences. The Washington State Academy of Sciences is funded by the government of Washington State, and it is to create ready access of scientists of all different ilk, so that when the legislature, the governor, or other lawmakers need science on specific topics, salmon recovery, for example, they can call the Washington State Academy of Sciences and say, what do you know about this? We'd like to start a program to figure out salmon predation. So they go to them for very specific science on climate issues, or on opportunities for the state. Where should we be going next with technology? So it's a wonderful organization, but they were running on a budget of $150,000. Their budget changed to $750,000. There was an allocation in March of last year. So they decided to embark on a strategic planning process about what do we do about this growth opportunity. So theirs was not so much to change the mission. Actually, it wasn't. They didn't change the mission at all when we went through the process, but it was to really state new strategic goals. Through this, they realized that their board is actually an appropriate board for where they're going next. They're represented very well, 16 board members. And they found their mission statement was correct, but they needed to scale up. So what are the opportunities? Where do we need to improve? Many people, and I thought they would do this, they would go straight to the programs and say, where can we spend more money on more science? One of the things that they did was they backed right into DEIA and said, we need to work much more toward diversity and inclusion in not only the work that we're doing, but also in the opportunities within the sciences in Washington State. This was largely represented by WSU and UW. So it was refreshing to me to hear these academicians walk back into DEI was very, very important. So it became one of the strongest strategic goals for them. But after 6 months, we had a 2-day strategic planning session. And those strategic planning sessions are also wonderful because you get a very social aspect. It's a wide-ranging conversation. There's usually a meal or two, but it really brought that group together. They were very cohesive. And by the end of it, we had extremely, very, very clear strategic goals for them over the next 3 years. So that was one that I was very excited about. It was a formal process working with schools. Finally, we have Sustainable NCW, and that used to be Sustainable Wenatchee, and that is a group that you may know about, and they were remain grassroots, part-time staff, trying to figure out what was going to come next. They'd felt some success in some of their programs, and so this was at the other end of the scale from the Museum of Flight. This was one where they said, we only have this much budget, this much time. What can we do with that? So I did a survey. I met with the founder and senior folks there, it's a small board, but I ended up meeting with each of them individually. And then we simply had a day that we got together and spent 8 hours working on strategic goals. And we found out that there were, there was a software tool that was very, very important to the organization, but expensive. And we also found that Sustainable Wenatchee, when they looked at the opportunities that were spawned by the successes they'd had in their program so far, they said, we need to take Wenatchee out of our name. We need to become North Central Washington. So they had a name change, and they found that they really needed to focus on getting the software tool in. And so worked on finding a grant for that. So it was a much simpler process, but all the board members aligned around this. We talked to different people in the community. What would you like to see? And this is what came out of it. But the software tool enables a leap forward. And that's what I love to see in strategic planning, is that you find ways to springboard on your strengths to really go forward, rather than just taking incremental growth, really take an opportunity to leap forward. So those are 3 examples of very different organizations and strategic planning approaches.
I thought I'd then provide one that doesn't involve as much necessarily a nonprofit strategy and governance consultant, but instead involves a branding and communications firm. Craig just did refer to a brand change for sustainable Wenatchee into sustainable North and Central Washington. And oftentimes that might engage an organization that has, or an entity or a consulting group that has more in the marketing and design realm. In this particular case that I'm bringing up here, Pyramid Communications is a mid-size marketing and communication firm located in Seattle, and there's many examples of them doing work all over the Pacific Northwest, including at Icicle Creek out in there in Leavenworth. But the example I'm using here is Amara, which is an organization for families that have foster care involved or adoption involved, families and children in the adoption and foster family system. And when Pyramid was called in to do work with Amara, they came in and did an audit and discovery process in order to figure out what are the tools that are in place, what does the brand currently look like, what is the organization doing in terms of communication strategy, what are its other goals that it has in place for multiple years of change, and what sort of initiatives do they know that are going to undertake in terms of major campaigns for communications within the coming years. Then they stepped in, helped to clarify how communication specific goals should be articulated to support that greater strategic plan that was there. They figured out who the main audiences and stakeholders were and engaged them to find out what sort of things needed to be heard or needed to be provided from a communications perspective for success in that way, including families, funders, community partners, government agencies, et cetera. And then they sort of drafted out the marketing strategy and the audience strategy for using different channels that were in place in order to, were either in place or needed to be developed in order to deliver messages and deliver communications out into the world. And then, and this is key, some people think that branding is just about creating a good logo, which of course it's important. As you can see on the screen there, you can see Pyramid's logo. You can see the special initiative that Amara created for their fostering family initiative and the logo that they created for that. But it goes beyond just a logo and a color scheme for your design and gets into things like what are the key messages that you might put in different places on your website, in your donor pitch materials, in your general communications that get across what your outcomes are, get across what your programs are there to do, what your objectives are. Of course, a mission, a vision statement, a value statements are important and incredibly helpful in communicating things. But having a grid of sentences about your organization that can be dropped into different things and don't have to be generated from new every single time in order to communicate your primary purpose and the nature and character of the organization can be helpful. So generally speaking, creating that brand messaging platform, the design elements and style guide that support it can drive towards an improvement overall of all of the assets in the portfolio, which is what Pyramid did for the Fostering Family Initiative and for Amara across the board. I believe this was about a 6-month project. This isn't one that I worked on myself, although I have partnered with Pyramid on projects in the past, and especially where that brand and messaging platform needs to be acculturated into the board of directors itself, so that the board members could start to use those messages more actively in doing pitch meetings with potential funders, in communicating out to the community the value of the organization. The main reason why we added this one to the list here is that it's a different kind of consultant that you would probably find yourself engaging. Pyramid does a lot of work with nonprofits, but is certainly not a nonprofit only oriented consultation firm. And they work with plenty of for-profit entities and government agencies as well. those are the case studies examples, but as we get into this last section here and then open it up for questions, we can certainly go into our various Rolodex of past experiences to pull forth some more examples as we go. Before we do that, though, let's just talk through the very specifics now that we've talked through a few of these projects of how to engage a consultant successfully, which we've talked a little bit about already. Just to kick us off, the topics we're going to talk about in this section kind of sound a little like that process that we talked about before, of course, which is how do you prepare for engaging a consultant? How do you then search and select a consultant? How then do you review the various different consultant proposals that you receive or conversations you have for that selection process? Then once you've selected them, what are the steps for successful onboarding in terms of contracting and then beginning an engagement? Now that you're underway, what are the key points in place in order to manage a consultant project? And including then the end, which is to make sure that at the end of the project that it's closed out well and that proper review and finalization is brought to the process. So I'm going to hand it at this point over to Craig to talk through that first section of preparation.
So one of the most important things you can do when you're to save time and your money is to make sure that you're defining your needs and then setting the priorities for the project. I frequently run into people who put the money first. It's like, how much do we have to spend? And the most important thing is to take the money out of the picture first and say, what are the needs and what are the priorities? What do we want to achieve? If we have a list of priorities, then we know we have to get this done. We might get this done. This could possibly, these others are optional. It's important to scope that for yourself so you know what you really want to get out of the project. So that's preparing yourself. Aligning your stakeholders, take a shot of coffee, and you share the plan. So when you have major funders or partners or others who are considered stakeholders in this process, you want to make sure you're communicating with them so that they're comfortable that you're getting the advice you need. This advice and choosing the right person for that is a very important part to the stakeholders. So once again, the priorities and the criteria for the consultant. So when you're talking about the priorities, it's just you want to make sure that you're getting job one done and job two is probably going to get done and so forth. So make sure that you set those priorities clearly so that everyone knows what they're looking for at the end of the day. And then the criteria for the consultant, I want to make sure that the consultant that we're interviewing for, that we're looking at, has got experience in this. What are the criteria for that? And making sure that they have either experience or knowledge around this that they're actually going to bring to the party. And that's part of the search and selection process. Now, defining the search and selection, you want to know how it's going to be led within your organization. Is this going to be staff-led or is it going to be board-led? Probably it's going to be a board task force. So you want to decide on what that search process is going to look like. And then you want to know how long it's going to take. How long are we going to allocate for this? And make sure that we're not just kind of wading through this over months, but say 3 weeks from now, we want to know this is going to happen. 2 weeks after that, we want to get a list of potential consultants, for example. And then what is our selection process? Who ultimately makes that decision? Is it the 3-person task force you've assigned, or is this something you're going to take back to the board and say, we have these 7 consultants, or we have these 2 consultants, and we need to choose which one. So defining that selection process is an important part of the preparation, and that just makes sure that it goes efficiently. This bullet point, I'm going to hand back to you, Andy. I'm not sure what it refers to. Ask ahead, hold informational.
Ask ahead, yeah. So it's what I said earlier when we were talking about how to ensure that the scope and size of the process is something that you work out ahead of time, is that you can actually engage a consultant and talk to consultants about what a process might look like before you're asking them to write a proposal. So hold informational interview or meeting with various different service providers before you even necessarily have the rest of these bullet points nailed down. Can be a helpful way to understand what does a consultant want to hear at the point when they're writing a proposal. What are the options for the size and scale of the work together? What are the what are the various different services that a particular consultant or consulting firm could be offering in the course of an engagement? And how much does a $5,000 or $10,000 or $2,000 project look like in terms of the amount of consultant time that's going to be there? Those are all questions that you can get answered ahead of time if you ask a consultant those questions or engage a firm in that process ahead of time.
And then finally, the RFP, RFQ. One of the things that's interesting about the request for a proposal, pardon me, and the request for qualifications. Sometimes the request for qualifications is to seed the field. So you may put it out and say, we're requesting qualifications from consultant candidates so that we can invite people for a proposal. So you may get 10 or 12 or 20 different sets of qualifications from 20 different consultants, at which point you can look at it and say, okay, these 7 are the ones that we really want to ask for a proposal. You don't want 20 proposals. That's a ton of work to go through that. But and it's a ton of work on the consultant's time as well. So making sure that if you have all the qualifications in front of you, that will help you narrow it down to an RFP. So that's one of the things that will help both the organization and the consultant.
Whether or not you're going to write a formal RFP and distribute it through formal networks, send it to particular consultants or firms, that's something you could decide based on what your organization is most suited to accomplish. But what's in an RFP is ultimately really important for the next stage of the process. And that's what is in these bullet points here. What are the priorities for the project? Who are the stakeholders that are involved? And make sure that you're articulating the priorities for the project and the criteria for the consultant in a way that's shared across those stakeholders. And define how long the process of securing a consultant is going to take and what steps are going to be involved. And then you can share that information with your staff and your board, as well as with the potential consultants that are out there in a way that is consistent and a way that is leading to a really fair comparison between potential prospect consultants. Claire is raising her hand.
Andy, just a quick question in the chat. Susan asked, when you say put the RFQ out to get responses, where are you putting it out? Where is that RFP or RFQ going?
And I can answer this. Craig can answer it as well. There's one of the reasons why I said maybe you don't need a formal RFP or a formal RFQ is because oftentimes the way when I see as Arts Consulting Group, when we see the RFPs out there from major projects, like we're responding to a $350,000 city project right now that's posted on a posting board for government agencies where there are at any moment in time 250 opportunities that are all posted from various different government agencies and governments, right? So I don't think anyone who's on this call, although I might be wrong, would necessarily be looking in the kind of organizational development that we're talking about today to find those kind of environments to post in, although you could. Those are places where there are the government agencies and nonprofits on one side and the consultants on the other side who are posting to what is essentially a job board for services. But most of the people that are using those environments are undertaking big facility projects, and they're looking for a building systems engineer firm to come in and design. That's it's so broad, the various different kinds of services that are engaged in those environments. So I think the process of putting it out there is mostly about distributing it to your board members, your funders, maybe some of your major donors, some of your partner and peer organizations, to say, we are looking for someone, can you help us find them? And hopefully some of those people say, oh, we used somebody last year for that. Let me pass this information along to them and maybe they'd be interested. And when I see an inquiry like that come in for myself, I always at least respond. And sometimes it's a paragraph, sometimes it's a 3-page formal RFP, but in all cases, it's much easier for me to say, that sounds like an opportunity I'm available for, and I'd like to talk more about it, if I get some sense of what the expectations, priorities, and criteria are for the consulting project. If it's not the right one for me, or I'm full up and I don't have time, I almost always will point at another consultant. I'm pointing at where Craig is on my screen, and say, hey, you know what? I'm not available for that right now, but maybe you should talk to Craig, or maybe you should talk to my friend Thomas, or to this, to Pyramid Communications, or some other firm out there that I think might best match that opportunity. So putting it out there, I think, looks a lot like you might use your network to answer any question, but by having a document in place, you can be very clear and have something for them to forward along to that person who should be the one to respond. Craig, anything else to add there?
Nope, we're good. Thank you.
Sure. So once you got that out there and you're receiving, or this is part of the process of getting it out there, I think I just basically answered all the things that are on this slide, is to go and get those referrals, go to the other nonprofit leaders in your area and board members who might know consultants through other boards. You've got that set of expectations and priorities in place, go tell people about it. Another place, and I talked about directories, there was one that I should have mentioned as I talked there that is actually appropriate to this, which is 501 Commons. 501 Commons is a Washington state-wide nonprofit organization who might even have a person on this call, I don't know, who is very active in providing affordable resources and accessible resources for nonprofit leaders and administrators throughout the state. And they operate a statewide directory of nonprofit service providers, and in particular, they're folks like me and like Craig, who do strategic planning and board development type work. So that's a resource that we'll point right at and say, check it out. Quite honestly, I don't know that my information in there is updated, but most consultants are doing a good job of keeping their stuff up to date, and it's a good place to search. Even if you're just looking to talk to somebody to get that informational interview type of thing, like we don't even really know what we're doing yet, and I just need to find a consultant that can help. That's another place to turn. And like I said, get that RFP out there, push it out into the world, share it through your network, share it with even a consultant you think might not be the right fit, because they might know somebody who is.
You know, just by writing the RFP, I want to put this in there. It's like anything. If you write things down, they become much more clear. And so by writing an RFP and then sharing that with your inner group and working through an RFP, it becomes much clearer what's important and what's not. It really helps in your prioritization and your language around where you're going.
Craig, do you want to take this next one on once you've gotten proposals, selection process?
So once you've gotten the proposals in, you know, I think face-to-face is always, you know, you'll go through some written proposals and just, it's just like job applicants. There'll be any number of them and you're like, I just don't feel it here. This one's just not right. But the face-to-face process is, you'll learn so much more from someone face-to-face. And that happens in hiring as well. So you collect your proposals, you have a date by which they must be in, you know, by the 1st of March, we're going to have all the proposals, that's your deadline. And then yourselves, you want to know what your selection process is and the date by which you're going to make a selection. And that it's good to tell the consultant that as well. We hope to be back to you by the 21st of March with the selection. So that way everyone knows what the, you know, sort of how this is going to flow. But you collect the proposals and then take a look first, you know, on the proposal itself, and then look at their website. And most of us have websites. Most consultants have websites. Some of them are more teaser than anything else, but it's you'll get a feeling for their language and the way they speak, and it'll give you a feeling for whether they're a fit for your organization. It's a start anyway. The next part is specific experience. And so this, I cannot overstate this. I am a nonprofit consultant. And if you come to me to talk about strategic planning, I am absolutely ready to talk about that. Crisis management, I've been through numerous, top-level crisis management situations. There are lots of things that I'm good at. But if you come to me and say, we really need to do a forensic deep dive on our accounting practices, I'm going to refer you to someone else. That's just not my thing. If you want to come up with a comprehensive marketing plan, I'm probably going to refer you to someone else if that is your sole goal. There are people who understand social media far better than I do, and it's just not the place that I really specialize. So you want to make sure that you're finding a person who has relevant experience and knowledge, and really narrow that down. Again, face-to-face interviews will tell you so much more. And that interview can begin with that cup of coffee. And so once you have an idea of what you're looking for, and it may even be that coffee that helps you start to find that, define that need. But any consultant should be willing to, sure, let's find half an hour and have a chat. Those are wonderful. And if you can bring your board chair or someone who's deeply involved in this process, even better. Again, this is going to be a very interactive process, and the chemistry really matters. So if you just find someone you finally get them face to face and you find out they're super formal and super stiff, and you're not that kind of an organization, you're super laid back and people drink wine in the board meetings, or vice versa, you are a more formal organization and you find a consultant who's just super laid back, it may not be a good fit. So you want to make sure that chemistry is great. You want to make sure that you've got a really good working relationship and communications work well. Finally, if you're working with someone who is relatively familiar with your community, you should be able to find some references or find out what their reputation is. If you call the Community Foundation of North Central Washington and say, what can you tell me about Craig? I don't know how candid they'd be, but you may want to talk to some of the other clients that I've worked with. And I'll give you my full client list. I don't have a cherry-picked one. I'll give you the full client list. And you can call, anyone who has said you can call them, I'll make sure you have their name. Any consultant should be able to do that for you so that you can find out kind of what their reputation is. But that's a good thumbnail of what the selection process might look like. Anything to add, Andy?
No, I think I just want to point that we're getting towards the end of our time, and we definitely want to try and at least fit in a couple additional questions or points for discussion if there are any. So, but just to point out, there are 3 slides left with 3 more steps of the process for working with a consultant that we want to talk through. I know I probably could say this about any one of these steps, but I think onboarding is probably the most important. And I know I probably said that about preparation, but we're going to say it about onboarding now. You've found your consultant that you want to work with. You've come to some understanding about what the expectations are for the project. But really, when it comes down to it, this is this moment where you set all those expectations down in a contract that is then something you can refer to in the future. So a lot of the answers to these questions about the size and the scope and the scale, the objectives and the priorities are all things you worked out in the preparation phase. So it's not like you have to start from scratch, but you want to make sure that it's in a shared document that is signed by both the consultant and the representative of the organization, and that it contains these main pieces. The process, objectives, deliverables, and timeline, that set of objectives that we talked about in preparation. Some understanding of the consulting team. Is this one person that's coming in to do this work? Is it multiple people? If it's a large scale firm, you want to make sure you understand which consultants from their consulting group is the one that, or 1 or 2 that are assigned to your project. And if there's going to be a shift there, you want that to be understood. And you don't want to shift. You want to be assigned a person, not a large sort of faceless brand to do the work for you. What are the fees? I mean, obviously, it seems so obvious, right? As almost not to be said, but like how much are we talking about, and on what time frame is that money need to be paid? What are the billing milestones, and what is the payment process? How much, when, and how should that money come in? And this is key, some kind of escape clause or contract termination. It's possible it's not a fit. It's possible that priorities have changed. How do you get out of it? Both sides need a way to get out of it. If something is not a match, or if something's a problem, is it a 90-day out clause or a 60-day out clause? Is there a way for someone to say on one side or the other that we want to get to this particular deliverable, and then we can reconsider whether the rest of the project wants to go on? Some idea of where are the exit doors on this particular vehicle. And then finally, are there any requirements that you have in terms of licensing or insurance? This is very common with government agencies, that you have to be licensed to get a business license in the city that you're operating in if you're working with that city. And you have to have insurance as a consultant. So do you have any kind of requirements there? And if so, do you need documentation of some kind? A lot of small nonprofits don't necessarily need that documentation, but if you do have anything, that you name it in the agreement, and be sure to receive it then from the consultant. Finally, obviously contracting is one step of onboarding, but then there's the contract signed and it's time to actually undertake the work together. So want to make sure that in the onboarding process that the consultant knows the roles of the various different players on your committee or your board or your staff, that they have the right contact info to get started, and that you're not spending the first 2 weeks just sort of fumbling through the wrong email addresses, and that there's that they're brought on board to whatever systems of collaboration are already in place, or that they help you put some kind of system of collaboration in place where there isn't one, around file sharing, calendaring, video conferencing, messaging, surveys. And oftentimes consultants have all of those tools that they might have their preferred version of it, but they may be using Google or Zoom while you're using Microsoft, and it's entirely possible that they need to be set up on an account or get one themselves to join you in that space. Finally, the onboarding process, I think, also is about providing good foundational background materials, so that if it's, for example, a budget document or your existing bylaws or some kind of previous strategic plan might be in place and exist, that the consultant has those pieces, things that you might take for granted or as given, or other board members might, is something that consultant's going to need upfront to learn and dive into your organization. Once that onboarding's done, you're turning around and getting into the management of those projects, which I'll hand to Craig.
Yep, and I won't spend too much time on this, but it's it is important that the consultant is essentially a short-term employee of the organization, but they're very independent. We're working on our own. It's important to understand that most consultants have more than one client. And so you need to make sure you're being heard, that you're being reported to on a frequent enough basis. There are some times when a week may go by where you hear nothing, but that should be explained before. So last week I should have said, hey, this week you're not going to hear from me. I'm deeply involved in another project, but the following Monday, I'm going to re-engage with your project. So you need to manage the consultant, make sure that the flow of information and conversation is easy, that you know how you're going to communicate. Are we always going to communicate in email? Are we going to do it by text message, telephone calls? What's the best way for us to stay in touch? And within your organization, who is the person who is the main contact? If I know that there's 5 board members on the task force and I can call any of them at any time, it's chaos. You find out that a lot of people really have no idea what's going on. You want one person to be that primary contact, and then you have a set routine of how frequently you're going to talk. So that's an important part of the contact. The other one is to make sure that if there's going to be databases and communications and writing that's going to be exchanged, who is the who's the staff member, perhaps, or board member who's going to be collecting that sort of administrative and logistical information, probably different than the main point of contact. So it's important to name these things up front so that we never lose touch with who is actually in contact with who. And then the periodic check-ins and reporting. It's just very important that we keep saying, yep, I'm still here. I'm still doing this. We're moving forward on this. I'm achieving this milestone. So that's managing your consultant.
Finally, any good project is only as good as its end. And so this is the most important step. I'm just kidding. This is another important step in the project, which is closing it out properly. When you get to the end of a project, as a consultant, it's really important for me to get reflections and review on how we succeeded and how we may have encountered challenges or frictions so that I can do a better job the next time. But it's not just about me as the service provider. It's important for the board or staff, leadership of the organization to know how they could do a better job the next time, because probably there'll be a next time. Nobody writes the single strategic plan forever for their organization. Nobody finishes developing their board of directors. So at the end, some kind of review on that process, a debrief meeting to be sure that those are at least named, if not written down somewhere and archived for future reference. And then there's the more logistical and legal elements. Ensure that the payment's complete, that there's some kind of documentation that both sides agree that the project is in fact completed. Even if that's just an email, hey, I think we're done. And with that final payment that I just received, I think we're going to close out this project. Looking forward to next time. Do you agree? Email back, yes, save those emails, right? It doesn't need to be a huge contract or anything, but some kind of written record that everything's complete. And we referred to earlier during the search and selection process, the idea of references. Is this client available to serve as a reference? Do they want to be named? Can they be put on their on your website as a consultant? Can I put them on the website as a case study of past work? Can I talk about them? I have gotten that permission from Pratt Fine Arts Center, for example, which is why I put it in this presentation. It's important to get that on our side, to get that permission. And it's an opportunity, if the organization wants to be talked about, for actually the consultant to go out and promote your brand and your information to others. Now, of course, if it hit major bumps along the way, the organization may not want that to be talked about. But the thing is that having those expectations agreed upon in the closing of the project is important. Obviously, then future work and future engagements is something that wants to be brought up somewhere. And I am always honored to get to the end of a project, and it happens all the time. And somebody from the board or the executive director turns and says, "Hey, this was great. You really know our organization now. Would you consider joining our board of directors?" Or, "Hey, would you consider donating?" And a lot of times, or even just get on our mailing list and monitor what we're up to. I love having an ongoing relationship with all of my past clients. It is true that they've rented a little part of my heart and my mind for a period of time. If I were to join all of their boards of directors and donate to all of those organizations, I would negate all of the good work that I've done as a consultant and give away all of myself, which wouldn't necessarily work. So don't feel bad if the consultant says no. Obviously, if I work with 10 clients a year and I joined all of their boards, I'd be on like 150 boards by now over the 15 years that I've been doing this work. So that wouldn't necessarily work out for anyone. And I think with 3 minutes on the clock left, that we have moved to the end of the presentation on getting good guidance from consultants, which means that we can open it up for maybe 1 or 2 questions here at the end.
Great. And Craig and Andy, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. We've gotten lots of good kudos in the chat box. I don't see any questions in the chat box, but again, we want to give folks a couple minutes if you want to add anything right now that you would like answered. And while people are thinking about that and either raising their hand or putting that in the chat box, I just wanted to quickly make a plug for the grant opportunity that is open right now. we don't have a ton of question or a ton of time to go into detail about that, but I'm always available to answer your questions. So email me, call me, and we can talk more about that grant opportunity. But the strategic consulting grants are $5,000 grants. We have 13 of them available in 2023, and another 13 will be available in 2024. So all the funders have committed to doing this for at least 2 years. So maybe you go through this presentation and you think, wow, this is amazing, but we just onboarded a brand new executive director, probably not the best time to go through a strategic planning process. So maybe we'll wait till 2024. So we wanted to be able to give you that option. And then I'll just say too, that on our website, there's a lot of great information in terms of examples of eligible projects, some limitations on the grant, who's eligible, and happy to help talk that through with you too over the phone or via email. And just know you have until March 31st. So there's plenty of time to rewatch the recording and to go back to your board and think it over, because this is a time investment, as you probably have gathered this process. It is a time investment for staff and board. So just making sure that this is a good time for you to embark on this work. And of course, there's no perfect time. We're all busy people, but just figuring out when that right time is for your organization to take something like this on. So again, Andy and Craig, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. I will stick around for a couple minutes if anybody wants to chat further, but otherwise we thank you for joining us today, and we hope to talk to you soon. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Happy Friday.